Okay. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Wow, this is amazing to watch everybody come in. I'll mention this a couple times, but just a small housekeeping note. As you would have seen, we are recording this session, and so if you're not wanting to be recorded, maybe you could mute your video, but did want to make sure that you mute that we'll be recording. Also, as we get started, we will be doing, Jessica's going to do a smudge for us, and so if you have materials to smudge where you are, maybe you want to get those materials ready. We're going to be started at about just 5 minutes after 1. So just watch everybody trickle in. So if you'd like, oh, Jessica, did you make a comment here? Yeah, no, if you please feel free to use the chat. You can introduce who you are, maybe where you're coming from. Have a little side conversation through the chat.
It's nice to see all the familiar faces, people I haven't seen in person in a very long time. Nice to see you.
So I'm just seeing a few more people popping in, so I'll just repeat a couple of housekeeping notes. As you will have seen, we are recording today's session, so I want you to know that if you don't want to be recorded, make sure you mute your video. Feel free to use the chat as you see. Oh, people introducing where they're coming from and who they are. So please go ahead and do that. And also, Jessica will be doing a smudge for us as we get started. So if you would like to smudge where you are, please get your materials ready, and we will be starting at about 5 minutes after 1.
It's so quiet. I need to say something. Hello, everyone. My name is Brenda Chalafu. I am from Edmonton, Treaty 6. I provide payroll services, tax preparation services to taxpayers, self-employed people, and as well as I'm opening up to corporations as well, and bookkeeping. I don't really like the bookkeeping as much, but I'm willing to add it in as people need that. How's everyone doing today?
Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Brenda.
Lots of hand waves. This chat is amazing. Oh, Louisa. Sorry.
Hi. Can I ask quickly what exactly a smudge is? I'm sure we'll find out soon. But
Sure, definitely. Maybe we'll chitter chatter about that a little bit before we head into that. But a smudge for many Indigenous people and other people who choose to partake in it is a way to burn traditional medicine, to send messages and prayers and thoughts and good intention to Creator and to the universe and out into the world. And so we smudge to put ourselves in a good mindset and to walk in a good way together. It's done in a way that's very natural. So I'll be using my abalone shell, naturally occurring, that I got in a ethically sourced manner from an Indigenous organization. I'm burning today there's 4 common sacred medicines, which are tobacco and sage, sweetgrass and cedar. Today I'm burning sage that was gifted to me. I utilize wooden matches as well, not a lighter or anything like that that's man-made. And we think about the thoughts, I'll say it out loud, what I'm thinking about. but to walk in a good way, thinking about opening my mind and my ears and my eyes to listening and being here in a good way and speaking good words and opening my heart to feel the emotions and feelings of those around and releasing the negative ones and just being grateful and thankful. And so it's just a practice to bring yourself present, to ground in the moment, bringing together the 4 elements of air and fire, earth, and water all together. So it's just a practice to start things out in a good way.
Awesome.
And very welcoming again. So it's not you're not converging over to a different religious belief or a religious practice by taking part in it. It is just a gesture of walking together in a good way.
Just fascinating to see where everyone's coming from. That's just wonderful.
It is. So many people from all over. It's wonderful to sit with you today, all of you. This is beautiful.
I know this is like a line from my favorite movie, Pretty Woman, but if I forget to tell you, I had a really good time today. Thank you. I'll be here all day.
You're welcome to tell us that in the feedback form as well. So please fill out the feedback form.
Yes.
Sorry, Nicole, I cut you off.
No, I think we started at the same time. I was just saying that was really sweet. The pretty woman comment. And it's sweet to say that at the beginning because you're assuming or saying that it's all going to be good, right? No matter what. So thank you.
Solid. Wow, we had 115 people here today. This is beautiful, beautiful. So if there aren't any objections, I think we can get started. So if it's okay, I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. Ahau, Neotutamak, Kiatamaska Tinawa, Raymond Matthias Nasikasun, Amiskochi Waskahigan Tinia. Bonjour à tous, je m'appelle Raymond Matthias et c'est un grand plaisir de vous accueillir ici aujourd'hui à l'Université d'Alberta. La terre sur laquelle l'université est établie est un lieu de rencontres et d'échanges depuis des milliers d'années et continue à être un lieu d'échange et de rencontres. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Raymond Matthias. Today finds me on Treaty 6 territory in Métis Region 4. The University of Alberta, of course, stands on ground that has served for thousands of years as a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many, many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. Starting as I did today, trying to share a Cree greeting as it was taught to me, I think it's worth recalling that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action remind us that Indigenous language rights are reinforced by the treaties and that the preservation, revitalization, and strengthening of Indigenous languages and cultures are best managed by Indigenous people and communities. Before we get started with the panel today, I'd like to invite everybody to pause for a moment of silence to remember and honor the lives of the 215 children who were recently found on the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, as well as the graves identified last week at Brandon Indian Residential School. While we extend our deepest sympathies to Kamloops Dissiswetmo community in BC and the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation in Manitoba, our hearts are heavy with the knowledge that the search efforts are underway on the sites of residential schools across the country. Every child matters. Reconciliation matters. And we are all treaty people. Let's pause in remembrance. Thank you. I will invite Jessica to smudge for us in a moment, but just a couple more points before we start. Panelists really wanted to acknowledge that many individuals are at different places of knowledge, experience, and readiness when it comes to discussing Indigenous peoples of Canada. Some are still learning and unlearning about historical violence, systematic oppression, and the long-term impact that has been felt by all Indigenous peoples and their collective communities and families. Some people have lived experience with different layers of oppression, depending on their identity as well. While others are at a stage where they understand the importance of acting and are looking for tools and strategies and advice on how to answer the calls to action. We want to recognize this diversity of knowledge, experience, and readiness that we can empathize with others who are at different stages. And we are opening this panel in a good way to create a safe and ethical space for this conversation. And we expect respectful behavior from each other. Jessica, would you like to do this much to get us started?
Sure. Thank you so much, Raymond, and thank you for pausing to remember the children of the residential schools who didn't make it home. Our hearts and thoughts are also with the families of survivors who have not always the best experiences from residential schools, and the families and the friends that they support there. So I'm going to open with a smudge today. As mentioned earlier, I'm just going to repeat what I said earlier for those who joined after that. But smudge is something that many Indigenous people practice, and also non-Indigenous people can also engage in it, of course, too. But it's sending and burning traditional medicines to take our messages, our prayers, our thoughts to Creator and into the universe, to send those up because we are here because of a gift. Life is a gift, and we want to be able to honor that. We want to honor our relations. We want to make sure that we walk in a good way together. And so I'm using my abalone shell that has been sourced from an ethical way from the West Coast. Today, I'm burning one of the traditional medicines of sage. So I have my sage in my shell here as well, and using woody matches, so very natural products to be able to do this. I've taken off my rings, and if I had glasses, I would have removed my glasses as well, although you can smudge your glasses because they're needed for sight. And so I'm going to light my match and start burning my sage here. So you can see the smoke. And I take this in. I want to open my mind to Creator and to the universe, to our relations, in order for us and me to see in a good way today. I want to be able to see the folks that have joined today in all their beautiful diversity, their beautiful backgrounds and experiences. I want to hear good words from those I sit on the panel, from our moderator, from those joining in. I want to hear good words, the good words and the good in people who are joining us today in the audience and will be listening to this via recording later on. I want to be thoughtful in the words that I speak today. I want to be coming from a place of respect, a place of love and courage and humility, a place of where I can speak my truth and not feel judged, to be able to share the wisdom I've learned over the years, knowing that I have a lot to learn still. And I want to be able to share honestly and truthfully, so that we can walk together in a good way. My intention here is not to build feelings of shame, blame, or guilt. It's not to perpetuate feelings of fear, even though I do hold sometimes fear and nervousness and sadness and anger. I want to release those and make space for those good feelings. And I want to really be able to take in what is said today, and take some time to think about it and see how I can incorporate the thoughts and words into future actions, to walk with Indigenous peoples in a good way, to with the communities in a good way, and hope that our words today have an impact on settler allies and folks that we need to also walk with us. I pray for the healing and the comfort of all Indigenous people, because we all carry bundles that are some days very heavy, from experiences that have happened in the past, from our past 7 generations, and sometimes they're from things that still happen today. And I pray that we can find a way to forgive and heal, but most of all, I pray that we find allies along the way to help us change the systematic oppression and the things that are out of our control, but in the hands of settler allies. And so I want to open today in a good way. And I am so grateful for every panelist here and for Raymond helping us to host, and for all of you for joining in. So thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. As you know, we're here for the panel discussion. I'm going to introduce the panelists in a moment, but I also just wanted to remind everybody that we're here for about 2 hours. If you'd like to participate in the discussion, I'm going to invite you to do so in the text-based chat on the side there. We do have a couple of intervals that are where we plan to pause and address some of those questions, so that is a good place to participate. But yeah, no, let us meet our panelists. So I'll start off with Jessica Vandenberg. Jessica Vandenberg is a Deneta born and raised in a very inclusive German family in Northern Alberta. She's had an exceptional career based on 2 engineering degrees from the University of Alberta, and has worked in the oil sands, mining, regulatory infrastructure, and consulting industries. She's an Indigenous professional engineer, industrial professor, and the Assistant Dean Outreach at the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Alberta. She also has her own consulting firm, Guiding Star Consulting, where she contributes to the Truth and Reconciliation, acting as a bridge to Indigenous communities, talks to calls to action implementation, and works on TRC awareness. She's a mother of 2 and is passionate about equity, diversity, and inclusion. She sits on many boards and councils, walks in many governance worlds, and does her best to contribute to the development of well-rounded and ethically minded engineering students who will ultimately build strong and vibrant communities within Canada. Next is Ruby Littlechild. Ruby is SNC-Lavalin's National Director of Indigenous Relations, and she's a Plains Cree from Maskwacis, Alberta, and of Treaty 6 descent. She comes from the Wandering Spirit bloodline, one of Big Bear's revered spiritual warriors. She's a key and vitally important person for SNC-Lavalin when it comes to building Indigenous communities. Ruby has an educated, grassroots, lived experience, and First Nations understanding of the communities that we build and their approach to community building. She is authentic, sincere, and collaborative in her approach to engaging, building holistic, culture-based, stronger, and more nurturing and thriving communities. Ruby is informed and educated and aware of the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples Report, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, the Indian Act, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Movement, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the importance and implementation of the calls to action. She leads and works to address implement, and create positive socioeconomic change in First Nations communities and their significance in the world at large. George, our first settler ally, George Lee. You can give us a wave, George. George lives and works from home in Edmonton, where he's currently employed, self-employed writer, editor, and photographer, and podcaster through his company Features West Studios. He is co-host and producer of the podcast Unsettled, Journeys in Truth and Conciliation with Jessica Vandenberg. I've actually listened to their whole first season. And so this is, if you, I definitely recommend giving that one giving it a listen. I really like how you summarized everything in the last episode. So it might almost be good to start with the last episode of the season. George has spent 20 years in community journalism as an editor, writer, and photographer in Alberta, in BC, winning a few writing and photography awards along the way. He has freelanced stories and photos for various publications, including the Edmonton Journal, Calgary Sun, Globe and Mail, Alberta Report, and Stock Car Racing Magazine. Our second settler ally today is Christine Channer-Auguste, the founder and principal of Channer Consulting and Training. Christine, you can give us a wave. Awesome. So Christine is the founder and principal of Channer Consulting and Training and the host of Fab Collective podcast. She's an award-winning, community-focused and strategic-minded communications leader with close to 2 decades of transformational success in education, marketing, cultural diversity, Indigenous relations, and finance. Her team at Channer Consulting and Training pride themselves in being an inclusive and diverse team and have built strong relationships with clients in various Indigenous and other racialized communities and organizations across Canada. A fierce advocate and ally for empowerment through education, learning, and strategic planning within Indigenous communities, Christine has traveled across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia to First Nations and Métis communities, creating training and innovative solutions that are accessible and inclusive. Christine specializes in solutions that are customizable, flexible, and mobile, with a keen understanding that delivering in-community initiatives removes the common barrier for rural clients who are unable to travel to metropolitan centers. So that is our panel today, and what an amazing panel it is. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Why don't we just jump straight into the first question? Focused as we are on truth and reconciliation, and knowing that everybody's at a different stage, I wonder if you could just start by, with each panelist talking about what reconciliation means to you. Maybe Jessica, we can start with you.
That in George's and I podcast, we call it conciliation, but I really like the term used probably throughout this panel and in other forums as well of settler. And so that means folks that didn't walk all their way here generations past, but instead came over via boat. So explorers coming here for a long time ago. But as you explore your truth and reconciliation journeys, you'll learn that from the beginning of settlers coming, Indigenous people were treated more as things rather than humans, treated very poorly from the beginning, being taken and given as gifts or a problem to be taken care of, or something to be dismissed, or something that can be controlled, or being uncivilized or savage, and that's not true. We are humans. You can't erase who we are. The identity of who we are is within us. And it's those conversations that are so important that settler people need to understand this truth and really see us for who we are. The capability that's there. Ruby is a living example. I'm a living example, and there's so many of the capabilities that are there and here. And we want to be contributing people within our country here, the nations within nations, and to get to this place of reciprocity, we need everyone to be part of that conversation. So when it comes to truth and reconciliation, everyone needs to take a part. And to me, that means having the humility to listen to the conversations and really embrace it, and concentrating and focusing on it, and putting the time aside for it. I mean, it's easy to dismiss and say, you know what, I'll get to that later. Or, you know, okay, I have that long list of books, or I have a whole shelf of books, but never actually read them. And so getting out and making it a priority is what, to me, reconciliation means. So thanks, Raymond.
Thanks so much, Jessica. How about you, George?
First of all, I just want to mention that the recording stopped on my end, so I restarted it, but I am saving it to my own computer. So I don't know whether that doubles up something you're doing or whether I have acted in haste by doing that.
I'll send a note to our magical technicians behind the scenes. Make sure it gets
Okay. So in the meantime, I'm recording to my computer, so it is there, but just so you know. Anyway, yeah, so I love that that definition of yours, Jessica, and I think that speaks to the complexity of what we face as a nation of nations, because there are so many ways of looking at what that word is supposed to mean. I guess because we have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or had one, and now we have the aftermath of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I guess I like to look at it partially in terms of those calls to action. I think that even if every one of those calls to action is not enacted in its entirety, or in exactly the wording that there is there, we should be trying to live up to the spirit of that, and that therefore this process of reconciliation can be taking place. I also feel it is definitely tied to truth. You don't have one without the other, and we are still working on the truth phase of that. And I think from the truth, we can address both individually and collectively, when we are settler or newcomer folk within this land, that we need to put behind our strictly colonial attitudes, or the colonial parts of our attitudes, and we need to look forward to a time when we are working equitably with all of the peoples of this country, and not setting aside, but moving past the aspects of ownership and exploiting and turning people into objects rather than individual human beings that Jessica mentioned. So I have this weird feeling right now. I feel both very hopeful, because I know that there's a lot of conversations like this going on, but sometimes it's also overwhelming because you realize how far it has to go. But we'll talk individually later on what that means to move towards that. But yeah, that's I think that covers it from my end.
Thanks, George. And I have positive verification behind the scenes that we're good for recording. So next, how about you, Ruby? How do you does reconciliation mean to you?
Again, it's about our acknowledging truth. I'm a residential school survivor. My dad is a residential school survivor. My Muslim and Goka, my grandparents are residential school survivors. Here in Alberta, we just agreed to treaty number 6 145 years ago. That's only 2 grandmas ago, not long ago, that we agreed to treaty number 6. And as a Plains Cree First Nations woman who survived intergenerational trauma as a result of the residential schools, because the residential schools created abusers. What the priest did to our parents and our grandparents, it resulted in intergenerational trauma in our communities, where the abuse became the abusers. So there's still a lot of healing that needs to take place. And there's a lot of oppression in our communities, and internalized oppression in our people. A lot of anger and hurt. The residential schools taught self-hate and self-loathing. So it's projected on each other in our communities. And that's where us as First Nations, Nehiyaw people, we have to start healing that. However, in my career, I've always worked, most of my career I've worked in mainstream society, and I've been lucky to find non-Indigenous allies who don't understand the trauma, but they know something happened. They know something happened. So I've the past 15 years of my career, I worked for the government of Alberta, the Association of Professional Engineers, and I ran a training and employment center. I'm now here at SNC-Lavalin, and I think reconciliation, when I speak to non-Indigenous people, I just want them to know the truth and reality of colonization and what it did to our people. In 1885, there was a banning of our ceremonies. We were put in jail if we were caught singing, praying, or dancing, and we lost our language, we lost our culture. My parents speak fluent Cree, fluent, but I don't speak it because of residential schools. They were taught shame. They were taught not to be proud of who they were. I grew up watching my parents walk around with their head down. I had to go to university to get an Indigenous studies degree to learn about colonization in the residential schools. My parents weren't conscious of their trauma to teach so I didn't know why I grew up with such oppressed parents and grandparents. But I had to learn. So I went out on my own, and I found my way. And I started to educate non-Indigenous allies, and I'm really grateful for my career, because I've worked most of my career in mainstream, and I found those allies, and they acknowledged the truth, and we were able to get stuff done. So reconciliation to me is truth and authenticity.
Thank you, Ruby. Christine, how about you?
That was me. So a lot has been said, and every time I first want to thank Jessica for that prayer. Thank you, Jessica, for opening with the smudge. A lot of it has been said, and I always say, George has said it, Jessica and Ruby, there's no reconciliation or conciliation or reciprocity without truth. And I know that is an uncomfortable point for non-Indigenous settlers, but I always say, imagine how uncomfortable, like Ruby just gave a small example, but imagine the discomforts that Indigenous peoples are faced with every day. So if it means we're gonna get a little uncomfortable, then so be it. Conciliation is active for me as a settler. Yes, I was born in Canada, but I'm still, a settler, a guest here, and it's active. It is our responsibility to actively, every single day, advocate and reconcile and educate ourselves so that we can have more understanding and have, when we know more, we do more. And it's not to say, for me, this is going to be a lifelong learning, and I want it to be. There's constant learning, as there is for some of my Indigenous peers, including Ruby and Jessica. But it is our responsibility, hard stop for me. This is not, the original stewards of this land have invited us in. Some of us, historically weren't invited, but we'll get to that. And it's our responsibility out of sheer respect. Like we are guests here. So it is up to us to educate ourselves and to build these relationships and to create understanding and to seek out the truth, because the truth is there. With Indigenous people, you can have a conversation. So reconciliation to me is active. And as Ruby has said, authentic, and, closing your mouth and opening your ears and not making it about yourself, but really opening yourself up to being like, okay, I want to learn. There's a lot of things I don't know. And we've seen it already where some people are asking questions. That is part of conciliation, understanding. And understanding comes with truth, as uncomfortable as it can be. Because again, if it's uncomfortable for you, add 100 times that for, you know, our Indigenous peers, because this is their reality. This has been the reality, and we've just heard a small bit of it, but this is the reality that they need to deal with, or have to deal with, or have to face every single day. And we've seen that recently in horrific discoveries, but these are not new discoveries for Indigenous peoples, unfortunately. I have communities, I'm getting an email now where we've been on lands where this is the day-to-day reality. So it's about active, and when it's uncomfortable, still leaning into it, and from a posture of humility and understanding and compassion, and being committed to learning, because the more you learn, the more hopefully action, reconciliation, as I see Ruby posts often. There has to be action. There must be action in order for us to move forward together, not separate, because the fear is creating the divide. And how do we dismantle fear and systems of supremacy and entitlement, understanding and listening and action? So I'll park it there.
Thanks so much, Christine. The next question is actually kind of an interesting one. I wonder, I can ask a chat question to the audience. How many people have a close friend from an Indigenous background? It's really interesting to hear people's reactions, but I want to ask the panelists, can you talk a little bit about you know, your relationship and how you met each other? I'd be curious to hear, because you're here as allies, and so we're beyond just friends at this point. So maybe we'll start with Ruby and Christine.
You want to go, Ruby? You want me to go? I can talk about you forever. All right. So I had the great pleasure of meeting Ruby at our former employer. So this would have been 2017, 16. It's all a blur. It feels like forever. And Ruby just has this energy about her. I'm sure everyone can feel it and see it, where I'm just like, I need to know her. And she's just she's such a powerhouse. And I love that. And I love supporting women. I love supporting anyone who's a powerhouse, but to see her in her element and empowering communities and her community with such ferocity, I'm like, okay, how can we be friends? And we started, you know, there was work that she found out that I was doing within the communities, because a lot of the work I do is within communities, Métis and First Nation communities across the prairies in the West. I'm actually in Victoria right now. But yeah, we just started, and when we started to work together, it was just immediately, like it just fit so perfectly. And Ruby is always so willing to teach, even when I don't think Ruby realizes how much I learned from her, even when it's not like an official teaching moment. She's just so passionate about empowering herself and her community, because it starts with self. And I truly admire that about Ruby, and we just snowball. It just kept on snowballing. So now we have left that employer, but we're still doing a lot of great work together. I love seeing her career just continue to grow, and the common thread is that she, you know, Ruby is always empowering herself, empowering her community. And I say self because, as Jessica and Ruby have pointed out, through residential schools and other horrific events and through generational trauma, there, you know, as we saw, it was to kill the Indian from individuals. So to see this self-empowerment is so powerful and so important. And then that spreading into community, and regardless of what Ruby and Jessica are doing, I know I'm, you know, Ruby's settler ally, but both women are constantly empowering themselves and empowering the community. And that is so, so, so important. Because then others see that and they're like, okay, I have gone through a lot, but I can do this as an Indigenous person as well. So that's how we met, and I'm never letting her go, and I love her very much. And it's just, I'm always learning with Ruby, and there's so much collaboration and so much synergy there. It's, I have a lot of respect and admiration for Rubes. Sorry, I was like, I'm not gonna call you Rubes, but I did. I call her Rubes. Ruby. Anything you would like to add, Ruby?
Just that we had discussions when we first met on how it felt to be how it felt to be marginalized in an institution and in society, and how we've always had to work twice as hard. And I don't say this to instill guilt, but I'm a First Nations woman with 3 degrees because I didn't want to go home and live in the oppression in my community. So I had to get all this education to armor myself up in the mainstream society so that I felt I was contributing. And I don't have white privilege, and I'm not a male. I'm marginalized, I'm First Nation. So I recall us having those discussions when we initially met. But we also talked about our allies who with white privilege, who we leaned on, who they're our champions as well. I had this great boss at Northwest College, and his name is Jonathan Robb, and he's a white man, and he vocally acknowledged his white privilege as a resource, and he always made sure I leveraged him and his power and influence. I have that here at S&C level, and I have white male CEOs, but they say, Ruby, if you need anything, we're here. So I'm so grateful that I feel the world shifting and changing, and we're going places. I'll stop right there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like Ruby is going to mention that because, again, of course, as me being from a racialized community as well, I never pretend that I have the lived Indigenous experience, but there is some commonality between what my ancestors and even my parents and myself have gone through and Ruby. So we definitely shared stories, and we use that to spread the word and hopefully create changes that we both want to see within our community as a whole. So
Okay. How about George and Jessica? How did you end up hosting a podcast together?
Well, according to our agenda, I'm supposed to go first, so I will go first. I don't. There is so much to. I mean, it started long before the podcast, but I had edited a story working when we both worked for the same employer, or before we did. But Jessica was a member of the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Alberta, and I was the editor of the magazine for APEGA. So I was doing fact checking on a story. So I kind of knew of her, and I'd seen pictures of her, and I'd worked with the writer, and I'd worked with Jessica on this story. Then she ended up being hired by APEGA in member services, and it's really interesting because now I have this new lens based on our allyship and things that I've been able to learn through the podcast and other things. I can look back and almost empathize with what Jessica must have thought of all of us privileged white people and privileged white men too around her. And it was so simple for me. It was just, okay, here's the new employee. I had been exposed to this whole idea of the importance of diversity, and I totally accepted it. But what I really wanted to know was that Jessica was just some other version of me in a corporate environment. So that's kind of where it started. Although I have actively strived throughout my life not to be racist and to be vocal about it. The older and more confident I got in myself, the more vocal and the more outspoken I am about being anti-racist, which seems like such an obvious thing, but it does kind of start there. And then I had this idea of doing a podcast. We both still worked for APEGA at the time, and I'd had an experience that kind of triggered the idea of a podcast. So I approached a few people on staff. Ruby was no longer working there, but Ruby also worked for APEGA for a while. And there we have a Métis man who works there, and also Jessica. So I talked to them both individually about this idea of a podcast, got some advice. And with Jessica, it was more than advice, it was support for the idea. It was like, yeah, we need to have me, you know, everyone knows what a go-getter she is, and Ruby too. And it was kind of like Jessica wasn't going to let me, you know, once I had proposed the idea, Jessica was not letting me put it aside and shelve it. And so she went her way, I continued on, and then eventually my job came to an end in Nepega, and she was right there to start the podcast. And I've just been able to grow within my allyship because of Jessica. So I don't feel like I feel like, you know, I don't feel, I'm not going to say I feel unworthy of being on this panel, but I am an ally because of the person I'm allying with. I'm not an ally because I went out into the world and said I need to be an ally, just that I had an idea that I thought it was something cool to do as a citizen of this country, that I knew this was something that needed to be done, that these conversations need to happen. And I was lucky enough to connect with Jessica on that idea, and away we went. So that's my little story on that.
Yeah, and for me, for sure, getting to know George, he mentioned that we worked together at Apega. And one thing as an Indigenous person, I'm a 60s scoop survivor, so I was put into the foster adoption system. It's a different path than the residential school survivors. And it has its own complications that come with it. But part of being a female engineer, number one, you're already minority gender, but Indigenous female, there are very few Indigenous female engineers within the country, and so often I do need a lot of allies and a lot of sponsors and a lot of partnerships, because something that Christine and Ruby mentioned is, you know, you already feel a bit behind the ball. You have to learn how to establish credibility quickly. You have to learn how to run the race quicker than everyone else. Otherwise, you're driven over by the bus. And that's very hard to get used to, especially when you come away with trauma and childhood trauma, and you're already low confidence, and you're already trying to be, I know for me, one of my tactics was trying to be invisible for a long time. And then I tried to blend in for a long time. And when I met George, I was at that point of the blending in. So to hear him say, you know, it's just another version of these, like, oh, she's cool, she's one of us, right? Like, she fits right in. But that was one of my tactics to survive, is to be able to suppress a bunch of stuff and hide it, and be outward facing that you're happy and cheerful and everything is great. But in actuality, there was a lot of behind the scenes healing and a lot of racist experiences that were weighing heavy and needed to be dealt with. And so George and I had a great working relationship at Apega, but we really have dived into a deeper relationship with this podcast, because he has created a safe place for me to share. And I know George has a lot of affinity and a lot of empathy towards Indigenous people, even through his own journeys and his own personal experiences where he can relate. And for me, anyone who wants to ally, I'm 100% on board. Let's go see what we can do, and let's just try. And though George doesn't have an engineering background like I do, he still has the engineering attitude that let's just try, let's just go try. And that attitude is so crucial in an ally. Like, you don't have to have it perfect. You're going to stumble, we're all human, but George gives it a go. And we stumble through it and we figure it out, and we make some ripple effects that way. So I can't say enough for George and your allyship. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Jessica. That was very nice. Thanks.
Before we go into our next question, I just wanted to insert a little bit of my context. Jessica has been running a series on reconciliation throughout the past year. Amazing for those of us who've been able to participate, just how much learning. You know, it's once you start with the idea of, okay, I want to be a helpful person, or I want to be a good person. But Jessica, you've just dropped so much knowledge. It really has been a very positive experience, challenging as it is. But here's some knowledge. From the 2016 census, we know that there are approximately 1.673 million Indigenous people in Canada. That accounts for about 5% of the population. So that means that there's a potential for 95% of the population to be allies to Indigenous people. So I wanted to ask the question to our settler ally panelists. What does it mean to you to be an ally to Indigenous people, and how have you been an ally? George, I guess this is a challenge for you. You can go first. What would you like to speak to this question about what it means to you and how you've been an ally?
Wow. I guess part of it is you really to be a real ally, I think you need, first of all, you need to put your ego aside, that this is something that is really not about me. So even the label ally, sometimes I have a little bit of discomfort because I'm really not trying to draw attention to myself. I'm definitely trying to draw attention to the podcast and do that. So this was something I could do. It was in my wheelhouse, you know. And frankly, there's tons of benefit to me personally, just in terms of accomplishment and creativity to do something like this. So I benefit from being an ally, regardless of all the other aspects of being an ally, that it is the right thing to do, that to get along with people. So it doesn't need to seem like something. To me, at its core, it's about being a good person. And I'm just trying to be a good person in most of the things I do in life. More so now at my where I am in my life now. I think I've been humbled enough. I've been you know, even with the white privilege I have, I look at my life and I go, okay, you know, just charging through like, you know, everything hasn't always served you. And so something like this is part of it. And I guess the other people out there, I mean, I totally recognize that people are busy with their lives and they have a whole bunch of other things going on, but just take small steps, whatever those small steps are, you know. And yes, everyone, you know, we always hear that it's a lot of work, but it's also a little bit of work too. The little steps are a little bit of work. They're just little pieces, and you can do a few of those little pieces, and you can start working towards being an ally, or at the very least, not perpetuating colonial and racist attitudes. Like, I would start by challenging the colonial underpinning of so much of your thinking. Like, start with that. Like, a lot of the things that I just accepted as truth were just my colonialist truth. And recognizing that is a step towards allyship. And also recognizing that as a nation of nations, we can all stand to benefit from this. We can stand to benefit from more people having a foot up in life that they deserve, because they are just born who they are, and they come into this, and that we can all benefit from that. Climate change, we can benefit from the teachings of the First Nations who were here before the colonialists were. You know, all of these things we can work towards the betterment of everybody. So it's almost I'm not going to say it just seems win-win to me, and allyship is just one way of is just an extension of trying to live a good life, and look for being an ally in little ways. You know, it doesn't need to be like this kind of official partnership that Jessica and I have with the podcast. It's just little ways, just every day. You know, it's not about you know, as Ruby says, it's not about, you know, shame and blame and guilt, and Jessica says this too. You know, it's about how you move forward in your life and how you work on a personal basis, not to perpetuate the attitudes and the practices that got us here, and then I guess the jump to full allyship is trying to work to reverse those things, and not only to stop them in your own life, but to reverse them. And so I think that covers it.
Thanks, George. Christine.
Okay, I have so much to say, but I'm going to try and focus. There's so much. Okay, so we've touched on a lot. George has touched on excellent points. I guess I want to start with what it's not. Allyship is not performative. I have to say it because it is a point, like a nerve that just sends off warning, not even, like it just sends off like a stinging sensation in the back of my neck. And what I mean by performative, you know, regardless of what the latest breaking media news is, we've all experienced performative allyship in the sense where someone might throw up a post and then that is, they've done their part. Cool, done, I've checked my box. Allyship is not checking a box. And I say that because I've unfortunately worked in environments like this and I've seen it, and it really, really is a problem, and it's just as damaging. You know, saying that you're an ally only to revert back to colonial behavior is just as damaging. That's what's keeping this, that's one of the reasons this is still happening. And we need to, again, sit with the truth. And it's not about the blame shame game, but there are real truths that are there. And we'll continue to go back to that because we need to sit with this and then ask ourselves, as George has mentioned, sit with your discomfort and ask yourself, why are you so uncomfortable? Oftentimes, you know, we've heard terms of fragility. You know, individuals don't like to be called racist or contributing to the issue, but there has to be a level of self-awareness. And, you know, George mentioned a lot of people will put their hands up and say, it's too much work. You're doing the work anyways. You know, reflect on, okay, am I being part of this problem? Am I believing and perpetuating stereotypical things that we hear and see about Indigenous people? When I look at an Indigenous person, what's the immediate thought you're thinking? Challenge your thinking. Challenge, what are you taking in? You know, are you taking in just one type of content, whether that is art, books, TV, whatever? What are you taking in? Diversify your space. Like, you can literally start where you are. And this is work that you're already doing. Like, you're already doing. So when people say to me, oh, it's a lot of work, I challenge them to say, work that you're already doing. It's literally just taking a second and asking yourself, okay, how much, like, you need to know where you are in order to know where you need to go, right? So I know it's a little uncomfortable, but we need a little bit of discomfort. We need a little bit of disruption in order for things to change. So it's not performative, it's action, reconciliation, as we talked about, and really holding space. So this panel is a great example of that, holding space and listening to understand rather than listening to respond. Because oftentimes people just want to shoo it away because it's so wildly uncomfortable for you. You just want to shoo away the problem and just keep it moving. But that's more silencing. That's more keeping things as they are. And I often also say, use your privilege, please. You know, you're privileged to educate yourself. You're privileged to advocate. I have privilege as someone who has post-secondary. I know that there's a level of privilege that I have. So when I met Ruby, I could just be like, oh, okay, well, I've checked my box. I've talked to an Indigenous person today. And the reason I say that is because I have literally worked with people that do this, where it's like, here's my checklist of allyship, and then that's not allyship, right? So literally listen to understand, listen to action, and use your privilege to educate yourself and then once you know, share. And then maybe individuals will share. And not all, you know, a lot of times people are like, well, I'm not very active on social media. Not all work needs to be loud. Like I say this constantly on my podcast, the revolution is right where you are in your circle. And then once you start with yourself, then it could be with your family or your peer group. Are you tolerating when someone's saying something inappropriate about Indigenous peoples at your job, because that is an issue that we've all seen? Are you just ha 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 and be like, it doesn't matter? use your privilege, speak up, action. Like these are the small things. So again, it's work that you're already either contributing to, because there's no gray area. You're either part of the solution or the problem. There's no middle. Like we don't, the privilege is thinking that you get to kind of ride the line. That's part of the privilege. Privilege is things you don't have to think about. It's like, oh, well, that doesn't matter to me, so let them be over there. No. And I'm like, I can't wait for this question, because these are things I've had these discussions with, you know, fellow Indigenous people, with non-Indigenous, non-racialized, and this is how we change the narrative. This is how we create space, hold space and create space for Indigenous peoples. As George has said, this is not about ego. This is not about them versus us. You know, colonizing supremacist systems have us thinking that Indigenous people are down here and others are up here. We need to dismantle that. We need to, and that is so egocentric. It needs to change, and it changes with us. So I just really like to reinforce, you know, how much, just like how I talked about with Jessica and Ruby doing their own work and then empowering their community, we can literally as allies do the same thing. As I was continuing to do work with Ruby and moving to Alberta, because I spend my time between the Toronto area and Alberta. When I moved to Alberta, it was night and day, because the education and the understanding and even the exposure to Indigenous peoples in the urban centers was very different. And then when I learned that Alberta, Edmonton specifically, has one of the highest urban populations in the country, but yet 4% of corporations are actively involved and actively hiring Indigenous persons. And from that stat, it's usually kind of entry-level jobs, even if they have 3 degrees like Ruby. I'm like, no. Something has to change. So I'm like, this is my responsibility to educate through the training programs, whether it's educating through Indigenous cultural awareness, which I don't provide. Let me just put that out there. That is facilitated by Indigenous peoples, but I'm going to be a bridge between corporations and Indigenous people, because this is ridiculous. 4%, let that sink in, 4% of corporations in Canada. So if you are an HR professional, ask yourself, how many Indigenous people work within your organization? Why? I'm gonna stop, because I can just keep on going and going, but those are like kind of the key points I want to talk about, because again, it's a little bit, but again, even if stuff is coming up, ask yourself what is coming up. And use that energy to action and to start doing some self-work and then community work and family work and whatever that looks like, because we're already doing the work. It's just where you want to direct the energy. More of the same or the road to change. No middle, it's one or the other. I'll be quiet.
Christine, you don't need to be quiet, actually. And if I could invoke some of my own privilege, my moderator privilege. If you want to play the and another thing cards, please go ahead.
It's just, honestly, it's just one of those things where, you know, we tend to dance around and walk on eggshells because, you know, oh, fragility might get triggered. Oh, this might be uncomfortable. Stop with that, please, because that's the same energy that is fueling microaggressions, that is fueling more of the problem. And I just feel that individuals don't realize how much power you have. There's power in your privilege. So what are you using it for? Are you using it to contribute to more of things? And at the end of the day, I know this is going to sound, maybe some might take offense, but oftentimes, even individual, again, I have a university degree, so therefore there is privilege that comes with that and a responsibility. But oftentimes people don't want to, you know, step over there and do things different because the cost of the privilege and power that they have, they don't want to give it up. They don't want to give it up. That's the hard reality. So it's like, that is a hard pill to swallow, but ask yourself, are you not doing this because it's so comfortable where you are and you don't care about how the others are? That's usually what it is. The cost of the power of your privilege is too much of a risk for us to literally extend rights and courtesies and all of the things to the original people of this land. Like, sit with that for a moment. Like, this land doesn't belong to us. Ruby and Jessica and other Indigenous peoples, this is their land. This is Turtle Island. This belongs to them. We came here uninvited, invited, depends on the group. And now we are just perpetuating all sorts of narratives. How many times I was at, just out shopping, my sister and I, when I was home, and my sister was telling the individual at the LCBO, which is the wine store in Ontario, oh, you work with them? Why do you help them? Because I guess Black people are not allowed to help Indigenous people. That is an actual statement that was said to me. Why do you help them? And then he inserted a stereotype, a common stereotype around Indigenous people, but he used the term natives. And my sister was like, literally saw the moment where steam was coming out of my ears. And I didn't create a scene, but I used that as a moment to educate him and to check him, put down my purchase and left. Because what are we supporting? We have power in where our money goes. So like these earrings, these are handmade by an amazing artist. I purchase from a number of different people, local artisans, but sometimes people are like, shop local, shop local. If you're all about shop local, I'm sure there's a ton of people who are listening. How much of that local is Indigenous artists, right? So it's like, observe what you're taking in, observe what you're reading, observe what you're watching, observe even on like TikTok, like whatever it is, there's spaces for Indigenous people. You just have to shift. You just have to make that. That's why I say it's constant work, but it's work we're already doing. And it has to come from a level of self-awareness, knowing where you are in order to do better. Like I said, when I found out about that 4% engagement of corporations, I could have been like, okay, cool, keep it moving. But I was like, and that's when Ruby and I, within our first meeting, we had 3 programs we ran the first Indigenous only flight attendant program at Norquest, the first Foundations of Cooking, all Indigenous. And I was ready for people to come for me and say, why is it all Indigenous? That's reverse racism. I'm ready for those comments. But again, within a week, we had these programs because I'm like, there has to be a change. And if corporations are saying, oh, they're not trained, well, I'm going to remove that barrier and we're going to create training and we're going to work with employment partners, period. Right? So yeah, it's there. I guess, to summarize, it's like, do your work, understand where you are, and then make a decision which side you're on, because there is no middle here. Riding the middle is riding your privilege for your own gain and to keep you in that position of power. And stop.
Oh, no, thanks, Christine. I'm actually just going to read somebody's comment there that Nicole was saying, I love your voice. Like just and thanking you, Christine. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Just to pivot on the flip side, it's some great comments from George and Christine. But for Jessica and Ruby, we could argue that it's equally important that an ally listen to Indigenous people to see what fits and what works for them. So, can I ask you, as an Indigenous person, what traits or actions do you expect from an ally? Maybe Ruby, we can start with you.
Authenticity. I'm big on finding real people, but I find you attract what you are. So I've been lucky to just attract really sincere, honest, authentic, positive, empowering people. And I know that's who I strive to be. So I've attracted that into my circle. And yes, I'm lucky. I'm really grateful to be here at SNC Laval and to work with the colleagues that I work with. They're solvers. And like I said, I think it's the law of attraction, and I think if you attract what you are, and I look for, I don't want somebody who's gonna feel guilty, because guilt is self-abuse. I just want someone who solves and wants to create change and just keep, and who wants to make the world a better place, because I'm big on that. You know, I have daughters and granddaughters. I want them to experience a better world than my parents and my grandparents experienced. And I've been exposed to racism working in mainstream most of my career, but I've always, and because I worked most of my career with in mainstream, I know racism when I see it. And I've always learned to navigate it. I worked at the Alberta legislature building for 4 years. I was exposed to racism there. I worked at APEGA, where I was exposed to elitists who some loved lording over me. And then but as I grew and evolved personally, and my self-esteem and confidence grew, and then I did my master's degrees, and I learned about oppression and patriarchy and power and privilege. Everything started to make sense. And I look for those who don't want to oppress people, but want to empower people. Like I said, I've been lucky to have a lot of non-Indigenous bosses and allies who didn't know, but they wanted to learn. And they're so sensitive. My Indigenous boss, my non-Indigenous bosses and allies, they're so kind. They're kind. Yeah, that's what I look for. I'll stop right there.
Thanks, Ruby. How about you, Jessica?
Definitely. For me and an ally on an individual level, I look for very similar traits to Ruby. Authenticity. You can tell right away when, as Christine put it, someone has a checklist and it's like, okay, talk to an Indigenous person that counts as consultation. You know, you can tell right away in your gut if it's chatter or if it's really true and meaningful. And a true meaningful relationship to me is someone who does give me the space to talk, even if they can't relate, even if they don't understand, and someone who acknowledges the feelings around this. I know some of the trauma that I've been through, you're often, when you tell the people the stories of things that happened, they'll say, oh, they'll diminish it or dismiss it and say, oh no, that couldn't be what happened, or that person couldn't have done that, or they make it small when in my world it is really, really big. And that to me is extremely hurtful and doesn't help my healing by any means. So someone who gives me the space and doesn't dismiss or diminish the feelings that I'm having, because they are really big to me. It's taken a while to find my voice. Those who knew me back in childhood know that I was incredibly introverted for many reasons. That was the time in my life where I was being very invisible. So because again, I was minority in my community, growing up in rural Alberta. So very few other Indigenous people around. So I worked very hard to be invisible so I wouldn't be targeted or bullied or anything like that. I'd just be ignored and I would freeze. So sometimes it's hard for me to find the words and my voice. And so sometimes it's just nice for someone to just sit with me and not say anything. For me as well, because of that, it means so much when an ally is my voice when I can't find my voice in the moment. So I think through some of the things that I would term as racist things towards me, even if they were unconsciously done. But things like, I remember sitting at a movie screening and they were throwing gifts into the audience. And one of the gifts that they threw to me were a pair of gloves, and one with a cowboy on one and a dead Indian on the other. And my person that I went with spoke up for me on that. I remember going on a ski trip, on a bus ski trip. We arrived very late because you drive all through the night to get there. And the doors of the motel were locked. And the person in front of me waiting to get in just says, the one buddy says to his friend, oh, why do you think the doors are locked? They should know we were coming. They said, well, it's probably to keep out the drunk natives. And he said that right in front of me, and his friend kind of said, hey, and hit him. And I'm glad for the person next to me who was able to say something, because I can't always speak for myself in the moment. I will always speak for somebody else in the moment. But for me, like it's hard for me to do. one of the biggest racist events that led to PTSD. Many Indigenous people have PTSD and complex PTSD for many of the things that happened to us. But I was asked to leave a hospital during a miscarriage. The doctor asked me to leave. And if it wasn't the nurses in that situation were my allies, they spoke up for me, for that doctor, and argued to that doctor in order to keep me there. They weren't successful, so they found a workaround. So they said, you know, we can't change this doctor's mind. What we're going to do is we're going to check you out and check you in again right away. And we're going to hide you and hook you up to IV, because I had lost a lot of blood at that time, and wait for the next doctor to come on call, which was about 9 hours later. So these nurses for me were allies in that situation. And if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have got the care that I needed. And I don't know what I would have done. So it's little things like that, people acting in the moment and not ignoring situations that are happening right in front of them. That's so important. And when I think about the employers that I've had, the leaders I've had as well, I've had some good allies, I've had some poor leaders, and I work very hard to learn from both of them in my leadership style. But I'd want my leader to be someone who is informed on truth and reconciliation, on EDI, to create those safe, ethical spaces where I could raise anything that I couldn't deal with myself, and to use their position of privilege and authority to speak up for me, for Indigenous peoples, to influence policy change, to sponsor for project work and things like that. And from an organizational standpoint, an organizational ally, it's equity policy and framework. For me, because I do have PTSD, complex PTSD, I'm very motivated in my own healing journey. And so I do see a professional therapist. I have built my support systems around me through friends and colleagues and a variety of things that I do in order for me to survive. But therapists cost a lot of money, $200 an hour at the minimum usually, and most benefit plans cover maybe 2 sessions. 2 sessions is not enough. And so advocating for better benefits that can cover things like that. Community as well has a lot more deaths, a lot of family deaths because of the intergenerational trauma. So being flexible in time off, understanding when a death happens, that we do need to pause. There is ceremony to be done, there's grieving to be done, and that it feels like I'm always in a grieving cycle. But understanding that and having some empathy around that, having things like whistleblower policies, things like that. And for me, for allyship, for larger entities, I guess, for lack of a better word, like from governments or churches or other people or organization, is to use your voice, use your position of power, as Christine had said. I don't sit in the rooms where they're passing legislation. I don't sit in rooms to talk to the ministers. I don't sit in rooms where we can make some really impactful change for the systematic oppression that's built into our systems. The Union Act is still in effect today, and there's bills being passed right now. So using our positions to influence our MLAs, our MPs, our city councilors, even our presidents of our university, our councils that we sit on, like our technical associations, UPHEGA, like everyone has a part to play in this. And those sitting in position of power have a responsibility, just like Christine said, and it just makes me so mad when they're not informed and when they're not representing Indigenous people. And so whenever I can, I use my privileged positions on boards and councils to influence that. But it needs settler allyship, because Indigenous people often don't sit on those committees. That to me is what I look for in allyship from people outside of the employers that I have, but also in the employers that I have. So this idea of building long-term meaningful relationships is so important, and it's so key, and it can lead to positive change in so many ways. So there are many levels that I look for allyship. And for me, it is personal, because it's my life and my children's life and my parents' life and my grandparents' life. And for me, I can't emphasize enough that I need all of your help. So thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. I just want to read a couple comments because some people have said what a lot of people are probably feeling. One participant said that was heartbreaking and eye-opening. Thanks so much for sharing. Several comments being in awe of your strength. And then there was a comment here from Nesreen, just probably when you were sharing the story in the hospital. She said, wow, can we pause? You know, that was very powerful to hear. And maybe there's some wisdom there. Maybe we can pause for a moment and ask, perhaps either in the chat, or does somebody want to unmute their microphone and ask a question of the panelists? We could kind of change gears for a second, but wow.
Hi, can you hear me?
Can I hear?
Sorry. Yeah. My name is Wati Rahmat. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Wati. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So Jessica, you know, I've worked with Jessica before. We're not in the same department, but when we were at PIGA, and you know, I've always admired her as a strong woman, and to hear that her showing that vulnerability, there is strength in that, there is power in that, and I'm just saying that I'm here for you, and that I feel your pain, and I hope to events like this, we will come up, you know, with better actions, you know, to do justice. Thank you, Jessica, for your voice.
Thank you, Wati, and thank you for being here. I know you're an advocate for your people as well, and there's been a lot of injustice towards your people as well. So I just want to reach out and offer my sympathy and understanding for what your people are going through as well. So thank you for that comment.
We did, thank you, Wati. Thank you very much. We did get another question in the chat. Can you speak about accountability? For example, the racism that Jessica experienced from the doctor, or the government, the Catholic Church, etc. What can we do? Like, is letter writing effective? Like, what can we do in terms of holding some of these folks accountable? Anybody like to speak to that? Christine looks like she's biting her tongue.
My allies write letters. They write letters to the Queen, to Prince Harry. They're trying to create shit, and I'm like, wow. But they write letters to their MLA, their ministers. They, you know. I think just creating education as well, and like I have a master's in education and an MBA, and in my MBA program, my professors with PhDs had no understanding or no knowledge of Indigenous peoples. So before my every MBA course, I always had to give an Indigenous History 101. And so there's so much knowledge that Canadians don't know. And I couldn't believe it that my MBA professors with PhDs had no understanding or knowledge of Indigenous peoples. So in my career, it's all I've done most of my career working in mainstream is educate, constantly educating. And I've vented to my dad. I said, I'm tired, Dad. I said, all I do is educate and share about residential schools and who we are and why we exist and have to justify why we're here. And he said, that's not your burden to carry. Live your life. But it's because I'm in mainstream and I choose to live away from my community and my people. I have to make the world a better place. But yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with Rubes. And then part of me is just like, that's so much labor and so much weight for Indigenous people. And as a racialized individual. I can relate to that. And that's why we have to, as Jessica has said, and we've all pointed out, we have to do this work together. Think about the weight, just in what we've learned so far, what we've heard. Think about the weight every single day, like wake up, go to sleep, dreams even. Like, this is an everyday reality for Indigenous people. So take some of that. You know, social media is a powerful tool. We've all seen how things have changed in terms of social justice. Sometimes it might take longer, but however we can bring attention to this. So the fact that Ruby's PhD professors had no idea about Indigenous anything. And then we have, you know, I know in Alberta, there's questions around what the new curriculum will look like. Who votes for these individuals? We have voices, we are taxpayers, therefore we have a voice and we should use it, right? So, and it does work. I know it's a lot of work, but again, are we not doing the work because it doesn't pertain to us, because it doesn't directly affect us? Like it's our responsibility to do this work. So whether it's a letter and tweeting and Instagramming, Facebook, whatever your platform is, start there. I'm not saying for everyone to now open a Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram account, but whichever one you have, leverage it. I have literally seen changes. We've all seen it, how, you know, you can call it lobbying, advocating. I just call it using your voice. I just call it, you know, doing things that, you know, we are capable of doing and we will do for anything else that matters to us. So this has to matter enough to you to create those changes and to take some of this burden off of Indigenous people. Now, I'm not saying to now tell Indigenous people's stories. Like, I always make sure that with the programs that I'm doing, it's always in collaboration, partnership with the Rubies and the Jessicas and the community members and elders, and following ceremony and protocol, and not assuming that every community is the same, because that is the wrong assumption to make. I never speak from their voice ever, but there's a way we can still advocate. We've seen it where George and I are doing this, and other allies that Ruby has mentioned. There's ways to still empower. So it's not about taking the voice away and contributing to the silencing. It's about, how can I leverage what I'm already doing and create more awareness? Awareness creates change. Awareness, you know, I've seen things where on Twitter there was such a big campaign and a lot of noise around certain things that certain policies were paused because it didn't look good for certain politicians. So again, even if it creates a pause, that's a win. And then keep on going, right? So it's doing what we are already doing and just doing it consistently. Like, again, why I grew up in Ontario, I never learned about Indigenous until I moved to Alberta. That is my experience. Why? So
I just want to add as well, when it comes to letter writing and things like that, government change doesn't come because we're in a democratic system. We need the majority of people to speak in favor. You heard Raymond say the stat that Indigenous people, even if we all cried out at the same time, we're 5% of the population. We need a lot more of the population in order to voice their dissent, their whatever needs to be voiced in order to make real change. So letter writing, yes, 100%. Send a letter every day, and send a letter to everybody every day. The government needs to hear voices alongside ours, because we've been crying for 500 years. And we have been saying this has been happening for 500 years. And we've been saying we have been hurt for 500 years. And it's taking incidents like the Kamloops residential school for people to say, oh, you know, this has been happening to you. Maybe we should do something. Yes, you should do something. So please start your letter writing, start voicing your opinions and be vocal about it. Because as much as we voice our opinions as Indigenous people, it sometimes is very much dismissed. And so voices like George and Christine and Raymond, like, these are the voices that will help make the change. We need the critical mass. We know that's 30% of the population. We won't make that without just Indigenous voices. We need your voices.
Thank you for those comments. I just wanted to layer one more question in from the chat. Janet asks about how can we best be an ally without putting out more emotional labor on an individual? And so there's a couple of different ways we could look at this question, but just the emotional labor of being an ally. Does anybody have a comment that comes to mind?
I think we're at a time where a lot of us, like Ruby and myself and many of our other Indigenous colleagues, are bridges. George and I talk about bridges a lot on the podcast too. You can't not have the emotional toll on it. Like, I know I will need a moment after this panel to collect myself and rebalance and refresh and things like that. But you need to be aware of it and know that when we need rest to heal, for sure. And where we can lean on you, we will lean on you if you offer a kind, authentic shoulder. Yeah, I don't know. Go ahead.
I think to add to that is asking, and there is a fine balance. It's not to, you always give the example on Indigenous Peoples Day that's coming up. We don't want to just put all that on the one Indigenous person you may or may not have in the workplace. But to Jessica's point, if there is something you're unclear about, ask, how can I support you? Because we always hear, treat people the way you want to be treated. Nope. Treat people the way they need to and would like to be treated. So ask, how can I support you? And as Ruby and Jessica pointed out, you know, one thing when we're doing some of our programs is letting employers know sometimes, you know, when there is a death in a community, there are certain cultural things that need to happen. So you need to get, and it involves rest and some time off. So there needs to be an understanding. So ask, whether it's your colleague, a peer, an employee, what do you need to feel best supported? It's a question, right? Because I feel like that is a safe space where you're not making assumptions and you know exactly what that individual needs and respect that and believe them. Don't bring in the gaslighting and the microaggressions after that. Like, oh, well, do you really need that? People, you know, this happens every day, or why? No, like, if you're going to ask the questions, be prepared for the answer and be prepared to support them the way that they would like to be supported. So I just wanted to add that from what Jessica's saying, because as Jessica has mentioned, sometimes, you know, when you're dealing with trauma and PTSD, I know I experience it, you don't have the words. So in those moments, it might just be giving space and then coming back and saying, okay, how can I support you going forward? But even before that, we don't have to wait until, we don't have to always be reactive either. We don't have to wait until 215 bodies have been discovered. We can ask these questions now. We can start to do the work now, right? Because as I said earlier, this is not a new discovery for Indigenous peoples. This is just a new discovery for the newsfeed. Just keep that in mind.
Thanks, Christine. George, I'm not sure if I'm not sure if you're about to say something, but the next question is for you, so you can add it into your answer. So the question is simply say that I think there are a lot of people who are perhaps in the growth phase. You know, they're kind of curious about, maybe I'd like to become more engaged and involved as an ally. And I wonder if you could talk about what your first step was as an ally. Like, I remember you mentioned the podcast earlier. Would you count that as your first step toward becoming an ally to Indigenous people? Just wondering what you could say about your motivations to shift from learning to action.
Yeah, you know, I mean, for me, it really does go back to my childhood. There was two really fortunate things that happened, or not fortunate things that happened, fortunate circumstances that I was in. And one of them is my mother. My mother was a very open person. I mean, our home was for anybody, you know. She didn't have much. She was a single mom, working as a librarian. We had nothing. I mean, we had nothing, but what little, if you could portion off of some of that nothing for somebody else, you know, it was there. and it was in terms not of monetary things. It was you know, staying with us. We had a pregnant mom or a mom to be, single mom, come live with us until she could have her baby. We had a woman stay with us who was escaping from abuse from her husband, and she had a small child. You know, so we had those kinds of things going on. So I had those kind of influences around me. And then when I started to have some friends, we lived right next to the reserve, what's still referred to as Penticton Indian Band officially on their website. I had friends from the reserve who were and I was fortunate enough that they were in touch with their own culture a lot. So I had one of them, and I've reconnected. I'm going to get him on the podcast. He's an elder now, Arnie Baptiste from the Penticton Indian Band. So that is spectacular. But there were things that happened to me in childhood that I never shook, you know, that I was able to, you know, I went to a powwow with them one time where I experienced being the only white person in the campground, you know, while the powwow was going on. And I go, oh, you know, that's what you know, like I'm a little out of place here. Isn't that interesting? You know, so I had that perspective on it. And my dad, who lived in Vancouver, you know, my dad was a different sort, but he was always the type too who would talk to anybody. And I remember we showed up in Mission, BC, and lo and behold, there's the Baptiste family. They're you know, the kids are there, and Larry, the dad, was there, who I used to hang out with at the Donut King. And you know, he was the father, and I'd hang out there, and he'd drink coffee, and was just this very, you know, there was a wisdom that oozed from him. And so I had that influence as well. He being an elder at that time, and me not even really, I mean, I just know these things without having been taught anything. These were just the people around me, but I still remember my dad. And so they invited us into the infield, and I think it was a rodeo or something. It was some kind of event going on in Mission, and we got to tour the teepees and everything in there, and and I remember being so proud of my dad. My dad never went anywhere without a sports jacket on. I don't think he was wearing a tie, but he always had the jacket and pants, and always looked like he was ready to walk into the office, you know. And there he is coming out of this, still have that image in my mind of him coming out of the teepee and looking entirely out of place, but the fact that he did it, you know, and how important that was to me, that he acknowledged my friends by doing that. So I had this, you know, and I had this connection. And then I also worked in Ponoka for a while, and had a lot of Indigenous friends there just because of the proximity to Mount Maskwacis, and also having had a history of not being racist, you know, and having friends who are whatever color. So I had that background, and I want to tell you one story, and I'm sorry, I'm taking a lot of time, but I remember the utter shame for my whiteness that I felt when I was walking down the street with Arnie one time, and one of my high school buddies, I mean, Penticton, the whole Penticton is like American Graffiti is when I was growing up. You drove up and down Main Street from one lake to the other, back and forth. So if you were out walking down one of those streets, you would see your friends drive by, right? So one of my friends hangs his head out the window and does a very Hollywood imitation of an Indigenous person out the window, you know, and it was just, I was so hurt we didn't even talk about it. We didn't say anything. We just kind of, it was just there that this had happened. And I guess the empathy I had for him at that time, that, you know, we're just hanging out, and I have to put up with that from my other friends, you know, who would treat him like that, you know, and everybody knows everybody. I mean, you know, I don't know whether my white friend recognized me before he did that, but I can still remember that feeling, that, and having grown up with my mom, who just accepted everybody and taught me to not judge people based on anything. You know, my mom wasn't you know, you have 3 chances. My mom was, you have as many chances as you need. You know, I mean, people with all kinds of problems in their own life. She never gave up on people. And so that didn't necessarily happen all through my life, but it was always lurking in there, I guess. And then this whole, I had an experience in Grasslands National Park in Saskatchewan. I stayed at a bed and breakfast, and the partner of the one who ran the bed and breakfast was a Cree man from Saskatchewan named Joseph Natauhau. And I was lucky enough to see a Truth and Conciliation event that he and a couple of settler folks put on about enacting truth and reconciliation. And then that little light clicked. So that was kind of my moment where I thought, I should be doing something, given my past and given my belief system, I should be doing something. And then I thought, well, what can I do? And then I thought, well, you've always wanted to podcast. So it clicked into my brain. And then I just stumbled through everything until the partnership with Jessica really solidified, and we really got rolling during lockdown. And and away we went. So that's my little story on that. Sorry for taking so long.
No, not at all. I'm curious. You talked about your aha moment at the end, and Christine, I wonder, you sound like you've thought about a lot of these issues a lot. And so do you have a similar kind of aha moment that you could go back to, or has it been a natural evolution of who you are as a person?
I think it's a combination of both. I've always had this, even though I grew up in an area of Toronto where this was not talked about at all. I've always had this, I love understanding people and understanding people's culture. And then once I moved to Alberta, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I just saw this as an opportunity, but I know I can be a lot. So I took some time to really do preliminary, like my own work and trying to educate myself, understanding that you really have to trust, like understand where the information is coming from. Because I saw an individual in the chat saying, they grew up in St. Albert in the Grandin area, never heard about residential schools, which is ironic, considering that name. But you know what I mean? So it's understanding the source, and Hollywood has done no favors. But then meeting individuals and creating relationships, and we've heard George talk about, we've all spoke about, relationships are key, and whatever those relationships look like, and knowing that this is about relationships. And this is not, as we talked about the checkbox, this is not an overnight thing. This is not a one-time thing, one and done. This is, in my experience, it's like the more I started to learn and be invited into, like the first ceremony I went to, I was weeping, like just weeping. And even when Jessica was speaking, because my heart is just like, oh. And as someone who has ancestors who were stolen and brought to a stolen country, frankly, I think there's that natural empathy, because I would hope and expect that individual, if Canadian Indigenous people were in my ancestral roots, that there would be that same courtesy and respect and collaboration. And we see that, there's programs I'm working in where, there's Indigenous within Canada, collaborating with Indigenous in New Zealand, because at the end of the day, we are, I saw that Dr. Pat joins, we're all part of the human race, and we are all connected. So it's a matter of respect. So for me, it was just that natural, my mom raised me to have respect for individuals wherever they are in life, and do things from that respectful manner. And I think sometimes individuals think, am I culturally appropriating or misappropriating things? And that is an issue. I know the panel, we had a side conversation about cultural misappropriation, and I'm so happy that Jessica started with smudge, because smudge is one of the things that we see individuals who have no idea what smudge is about, but it's cute and cool right now. So they're using smudge, and that is a problem. But I think sometimes people think that you can't be part of Indigenous ceremony. Yeah, there are certain ceremonies you are not to be part of, but I've had the great privilege and honor of being part of them. And it's another learning, as George has mentioned, it's another learning, it's an experience. It's part of that relationship, earning trust, knowing that you need to earn the trust. And for me, I always took it from that posture. When I met Ruby, I wasn't as not as I am right now, but just really approaching things with humility and sharing what I don't know. And if she wants to share with me, great. If she does not want to, if it's triggering, that's okay too. And then, you know, using that responsibility, like my responsibility to educate myself. And Jessica's mentioned, you know, the 7 sacred teachings, that is key within Indigenous culture. And that is how every business relationship that I have with any Indigenous community, organization, individual, usually starts with that discussion. Usually starts with, you know, an offering of tobacco or whatever I might acquire in that area. You know, respect, you know, it comes back to respect. How do Indigenous people want to be treated, and aligning and posturing myself in that way, not making it about me, not telling Indigenous people that this didn't happen or that didn't happen. Really, so again, there's like that natural inclination of how I was born and raised. There's that natural inclination of being another racialized individuals, but then there's also like never being like, oh, well, I know what it's like because I'm a Black person, so it must be the same. No, it's literally being humble and being quiet and listening. Listen, and then act. And then it will just honestly start to grow. Like, I am so grateful with the communities I get to work with, like to be in even BC right now and work with communities across this country. It started with one conversation, and that was down in Treaty 7, Métis Region 3. And, you know, even the understanding around Métis culture, you know, what I was told about it versus what is reality. And it was my responsibility. Like, when I heard what I was told, it didn't seem right. It seemed very racist. And then having a conversation with an Indigenous person with a First Nations and a Métis person to get more understanding. So again, I think it just comes, that first step. I think a lot of individuals who are on this call or this panel, this could be a first step, and that's great. But after this, what are you going to do with this information? There's been a lot of things that we have thrown and thrown your way. And so it's we go back, are we going to check the box and say, okay, well, I did my good deed for the year, see you in 365 days? Or are you going to sit with it and be like, okay, what can I do now? What is the next step? It's one step in front of the other every single day. Hard stop, you know, every single day. Like, this has to be every single day. And, you know, when Jessica was talking about allies, and we've all talked about allyship, there's so many opportunities to be an ally without, you know, your Indigenous peer saying, please be an ally for me. There's so many opportunities that you probably don't even realize. And now, you know, recognizing your privilege and recognizing, oh, this is happening, and what are you going to do about it? If someone is being blatantly racist, are you still going to support them financially, however, in the workplace? Are you going to say you're an ally in the office? And like, for me, I've turned away business with people that companies that are racist. You know, some of the students that work with me, that question comes up every single time. There is a definite fear entering workplaces sometimes because of the racism. They don't feel protected. They don't feel welcome. They don't feel seen. So it is my job and my team's job to vet every single employer that we work with to make sure that they're in this for the right reasons. And if they're not, I don't need your business. And it's not about shame. This is about, am I doing this for the dollars? Am I doing this because I'm not saying that, you know, businesses run on hopes and dreams, but I am saying that, again, we have these choices available to us. So are we just aligning with things and forgetting about all the racist things? Oh, well, they're a big high value client, so let's forget all the racism and just keep on, but then be like, yeah, I'm your ally. Or are we going to really start to, and that's why I talk about changes, and they are tough. But again, it wasn't an aha moment for me, but it was a aha, like just adding to how I live, because it's the only way this changes. And sometimes it is making difficult decisions. I know everyone on this panel, Raymond probably included, we've had to make those decisions, or those decisions haven't affected us. And we are looking around and we have no allies. So hopefully, you know, from this conversation, people can be like, no, I'm going to step up in whatever way that looks like. And there's so many ways. And if you don't know the ways, call one of us. We can tell you. Like, there's so many ways that you can step up. And again, if today's is your first step, your 10th step, your 100th step, today's a step for me in a lifelong journey. Please let there be another step after today, please. And then another one, and then another one, and another one, and another one.
Thank you to all of you.
Christine, you're just an absolute inspiration. Thank you so much.
You too, George. Thank you. I'm very passionate about this, and sometimes I know I could be like, woo! But it's like, it's so overdue, and oh, it's so overdue. It's so overdue. Please, let's just work. Like, we have 100+ people on this call. Imagine what we can all do together. Seriously. Like, imagine what we can do just with 150, with 5 of us, with 2, with 1, right? So that's why I get all excited.
I also really appreciated you talking about your identity as a person of color. I myself am a biracial person, and I quite frequently say that I never feel more white than I do in an Indigenous context. It's a very sobering reminder of to kind of check my privilege. I did want to give the audience another opportunity to ask questions to the panelists. So if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question or put it in the chat. No, I don't see a question here. If we don't have a question, interesting. No, the question I was just going to ask is, the allies have talked about their own examples of allyship, and I just wonder, have any of the panelists identified other people around them exhibiting good qualities of allyship, in a kind of third person aspect? Wow, that was a solid over there. Any examples come to mind?
I guess I'll start. Like, I was just having a conversation with a former colleague from I'll just say a performative allyship. It's very performative there. And we were just having a conversation, and she's like very passionate. She is a white woman. She identifies as a white cisgendered woman, and having a conversation with a client. This was $80,000 on the line, and she walked away from it because they were outrageously racist, like outrageously. And they even challenged her on that. They're like, is this worth are they worth $80,000? And I'm like, and think about that. Like, that's not small money. And for it to just like, without hesitation, she walked away from it. And yes, that's uncomfortable because she's not the owner of her company. She now has to have that conversation with her employer, but her employer was all on board. But without hesitation, and just even with the gaslighting from like, are they worth it? Are you serious? Come on, you must be joking. I was just like, I'm so glad that I have these people in my life, because it makes this work, this very worthwhile work, absolutely a lot easier, because there's going to be those conversations amongst others. So that was something that happened 5 days ago. We had this conversation. I was like, oh, it's uncomfortable, but it's great. It's a really great feeling when you can walk away from that, because now hopefully that organization will be like, ooh, I don't know, but maybe they'll be like, are we these people? I don't know.
I think one thing that I want to bring up too, because I know we've chatted a bit about some grand gestures and things on behalf of organizations, but just to bring it back to a human level, and for those who were part of the TRC sessions that I was piloting in the faculty, you'll have heard this before, but even just looking at Indigenous people, like really looking and seeing them, whether they're just walking along the street, or if they're in a poverty cycle, maybe they're part of the homeless, or maybe they're your colleagues in your classroom or your work colleagues, but just really seeing them, because one of the effects of oppressive systems it's this ingrained idea that Indigenous people are less, that we're less than you, and not worth our time even to look at. And I know for me, you can feel it when people are walking past you and their glance just slides off you. Like it's that invisible feeling again, and you can feel it. Or, you know, when you're in a store and, you know, they're kind of watching you to see what you're going to do in that store, or things like that, just really subtle things. But even just walking along and helping to restore the dignity to Indigenous people is so important. Like Ruby talked about seeing her people walk with their heads down, right? But if you look at them, you know what? It's going to help them raise their head. It's going to make them feel that it is human to human, that they have a station and a status that is the same as yours. Because on a human to human level, we do. And so just even that little gesture helps to restore some of the dignity, because identity is something that I know for myself I struggle with quite a bit. And I know we didn't talk about it, our aha moments as Indigenous people, but I know for me, a lot of what triggered my wanting to educate myself is my kids. I'm alive because of my kids. They have saved me in so many ways. But I do a lot of what I do for my kids. I want to be able to answer the question, like, where do we come from? And I want them to be proud of it. And I want them not to feel all these layers of shame that I feel some days. And just little gestures go a long way.
But I just want to point to that word microaggression. It kind of struck me during this whole conversation that it may be called microaggression, but the accumulative effect, the everyday effect of those little microaggressions, so-called microaggressions, that's huge to an individual. If you're facing them, must be, again, not speaking from my own experience, but must be huge to individuals, as we hear from Jessica. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thanks for that, George. I was going to pivot from the little actions, and Christine mentioning earlier about not everything needs to be loud, right? Ruby, I wonder if I might put you on the spot to answer the last question, and it just came up in the chat, and it's an amazing question. I'll just read it here. Kat is saying, how can settlers start friendships with Indigenous peoples authentically? And my family moved from South Africa to Alberta when I was a child, and we thought we would be living in a community with First Nations peoples. But honestly, it was only when I went to university that I met an Indigenous person. Forcing relationships on one's own terms strikes me as something to be avoided, especially granted the legacy and perpetuation of oppression and belittling others. So how can, so if somebody doesn't have any Indigenous connections or connections to the Indigenous community, and we've talked about that a little bit, Christine's comment about checking off boxes, and you know, how do you not be that person, and set about establishing these relationships in a good way?
So I had a transitory upbringing because my parents divorced, and I went from my First Nations community, my res, to the city, back and forth. And then like I said, when I was 13, I wouldn't go to school. I was rebelling against my parents because they divorced. So I wouldn't go to school. So they sent me to Blue Quills residential school but I only stayed for 3 days because I already knew the horrors and heard of the horror stories of residential school. And I ran away. But I've always walked in two worlds. I've always been the only First Nation in the classroom, or the only First Nation in the employment setting. And most of my friends growing up were non-Indigenous. A lot of my friends were non-Indigenous, and I didn't experience racism. I saw my family experience racism. I remember riding in a cab when we first moved to the city with my brother, and he was like 4, and he coughed, and the cab driver said, you know, he didn't want us in his cab. And I was like, wow. And then I remember we moved to the white suburban neighborhood. We were fresh off the res. And my little brother, again, being 4 years old, he wanted to play with the white neighbor. And he said, I can't. My dad said, you guys are bad people. So that's when I started to be exposed to racism, was in our neighborhood. What else? And I know I've been exposed to it just in my career, in my employment setting, in my career setting, but I've always taken the high road. I had bills to pay. I've always been in survival mode. So I kind of always learned to empower myself and assert myself. But I think just reaching out and saying, let's go for coffee. Christine and I, we kind of connected on our, we both collect shells and gems, and we're both into new age stuff. So we connected on that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruby.
Raymond, can I just add to that?
Sure.
Just very quickly. So Dr. Pat mentioned that I wanted to bring people's attention, and it really ties into what we're talking about. Like, it doesn't always have to be about an Indigenous thing. It can literally be like, we all have things that we shared interests. So it could literally be that tons of people love coffee, and Edmonton, for instance, is a huge coffee culture. If you like food, Ruby and I have a lot of things that we like that are similar. So again, and Dr. Pat mentioned in the chat, you know, we are all related. And when you're related, we all have commonalities. So sometimes it's just extending like, hey, do you want to take break together? Or, you know, your neighbor, hey, like small talk, right? So it doesn't always have to be about the trauma and the bad stuff. It could literally be just everyday conversation that we're having. And then, of course, as you're building that relationship, go from there. And I also want to bring, because I love Dr. Pat, she's amazing. So Dr. Pat's in the chat, everyone. She's amazing. She has put her resource for Treaty Walk, which is another great resource for settler allies. And her and other elders will be walking from Edmonton to Fort somewhere or another. So I just wanted to make sure that was brought into the chat, because it's such a great resource, and I fangirl Dr. Pat a lot.
Sure, and the prior one to that is there's Treaty Talk and Treaty Walk, so I want to make sure that we mention both of those. And I'm so excited that Dr. Pat is here as well.
St. Paul she just wrote it, St. Paul to Fort Pitt. Yeah. Wow. That's all.
Oh no. Well, we have had over 100 people stay with us until 3 o'clock, which is extraordinary. So I really want to thank all of the panelists for being here and sharing their stories. If you're willing, maybe you could put your contact information in the chat if people have any questions. Right, this moment here marks the end of our formal program. We will sit in reconciliation circle for the next hour. If you wish to join us, you can stick around. That session will not be recorded. Of course, my phone has to ring now. And so maybe we'll take a quick 5-minute break. We can stretch and we come out. I'll round up and I'll say 3:10. So we'll come back at 3:10. But for those of you who have to go, completely respect your time. I noticed a few people came in partway. This session of the formal part of our program will be shared at a later date. But once again, thank you, George. Thank you, Ruby. I'm just going across my screen here. Thank you, George. Thank you, Ruby. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Christine. It's really been an honor to be a part of this conversation.
And thank you, Raymond, for doing a wonderful job of facilitation.
Yes, thank you,
Thanks,
Raymond.
everyone.
Great.
It's just been wonderful.
I'm staying for the circle, but thank you, Raymond. You're awesome. Very, very well done.
And thanks everyone for joining in. I hope you stay for the circle. I'll be staying as well.
Could I just make one mention of somebody else who's out there that in the chat that Jessica and I know, and that's Nicole Weatherly, who has a magazine, online magazine called Superstar X Magazine, and it's just dedicated to all things diverse and equitable, and it's just a wonderful publication and really worth checking out online. And again, it's called Superstar X Magazine.
Thanks so much, George and Jessica. It's nice to see you both.
Nice to see you too. It's so nice to see all of you. Like I just can't say enough what an honor it is that everyone is here and that you've joined from across the country and outside the country. A few of you, it means a lot that you're taking part in these conversations.